have blind spots too, right? I can be ableist at times. I can do and say things that, are not conscious of the struggles of undocumented people because I was born here. Lots of other privileges. I went to a fancy college on scholarship, but nonetheless, right? I haven't been homeless. I haven't had to do survival sex work. There's a lot of blind spots that I have, and I have a lot of comrades who experience oppression where I have privilege, and I've had to be called in by them, by their generosity, to educate me over the past 20 years of doing this work. So I don't mean to vilify anybody, but what I do want to say is, if you're someone who's having that waking up moment for the first time in your life, please think of it as an opportunity. Right? It's an opportunity for more of us to understand that we need to do work to end sexual violence differently. We need to acknowledge that sexual violence in the United States is rooted in a history of slavery and genocide and colonization. We need to acknowledge that the state that too many of our organizations rely on cannot be a source of healing. Right? It actually, Just Attention International is here. I saw you in the program. I'm very excited about that. And I know actually Bambi from my board is actually doing a talk with all of you, which I encourage you to go to. But we know that prisons are a site of rape. That's why we have the Prison Rape Elimination Act. But an act doesn't make it go away. We know that there is a disproportionate number of women particularly, but also men who are incarcerated who had an experience of being raped or sexually assaulted as a child. I read the statistic once for people in women's prisons. It's something like 90% of women who are incarcerated have already experienced sexual violence prior to incarceration. So when we think about who a survivor is and what services that survivor might need, like personally, I do not refer people to the prison system. I'm a prison abolitionist. I wasn't always, once upon a time I was 13 and some prosecutors and social workers intervened in my life. And when you're a kid of immigrants, particularly non-Black immigrants, I think there is this fantasy of what this country is. There's this rhetoric of democracy and equality. It's beautiful, right? It's a beautiful vision. My grandmother came here and not to England because she knew that England was fucked up. But she didn't know enough about the American struggle, the American civil rights movement. She had read a little bit about it, but I think just as someone who was involved in the freedom movement in India and as a socialist, she was a lot more idealistic than this country could hold. It wasn't the reality at all that she arrived here to. So I wasn't politicized at all as a high school student, but it was my experience in going through the state as a teenager and experiencing direct racism from the cops, from the social workers, from the prosecutors, who said things like, well, we know this happens more in your culture, so you can tell us. Or who threatened to prosecute and incarcerate my mother because she had been complicit in what happened to me. Right? Or going through mandated group therapy when I was 16 with other teenage girls from Bergen County in New Jersey, where I grew up, and watching what happened to each of them, and some of them were other girls of color. The youngest actually was Indo-Guyanese, and she was 13, her name was Pauline, and she had gone through terrible rape and abuse by her brother and her father as a toddler, who was put into the foster care system, was re-assaulted, re-raped by her foster care father. And by the time she got to us at 13 in group therapy, she was so scared of men that the foster care system had to find a lesbian family to take her in. And this was in 1991. It was not like, yay, gay people can be parents time, right? And I say that to just try to highlight how traumatized children in this country can become, not just from what happens to us behind closed doors, but also from state intervention. The foster care system needs so much reparation, right? So much change. And there are great organizations like California Youth Connection that have figured out ways to start organizing people who have gone through the foster care system to be the ones that dictate the changes that need to happen. I don't think that's any different from what needs to happen in work to end sexual violence, right? We need to start listening to those of us who have been through the systems that are supposedly set up to help survivors who have been harmed by those systems, to start to understand what we need to do differently, right? The changes that we need to be advocating for. Pauline was actually, during the year that we were in group therapy together, put into forced mental health institutionalization. And I have to tell you, I'm traveling the country right now, recording audio stories of LGBTQ people of color who were raped and sexually assaulted as children. I've done 32 recordings so far. And one of the most common forms of institutional harm that has happened to LGBTQ people of color who are raped or sexually assaulted as children in this country is in the mental health institutionalization system. And it's interesting that we don't really talk about it in this work. We talk about the prison system. I mean, not enough, but we do, right? There is a conversation about prison abolition. There's a conversation about detention and deportation and detention camps. There's not, to my knowledge, my experience, a congruent conversation about mental health institutions. And I don't know why, because what I am hearing are stories after stories after stories of young people of color, particularly queer and trans young people of color, who are institutionalized either because of trauma that they experienced in their home, and then they have mental health disabilities happening, and instead of them getting a level of care at home or in their community, they're put into this facility in which they're often raped again by the guards and by other patients, right? Or what I'm hearing is people who are gender nonconforming actually being put into mental health institutions by their family because they are gender nonconforming, and then experiencing rape and sexual assault in those systems. And so that's what happened to Pauline. She went into the county mental health hospital at 13, was raped again in that system, and ended up taking her own life before the year was out. And it was on the heels of a boy in the county, same thing happening to him, taking his own life. The county hospital was shut down, there was an investigation. But again, that was 1995, and it just did not lead to mass level policy change. So I think for me, what's really humbling as someone who did not experience that particular form of violence, it's again an opportunity for me to practice deep listening, right? Even in my own community of LGBTQ people of color who are survivors, and to say we don't all have the same experiences, even though we live at the same intersection of oppression. How can I leverage my privilege just by showing up and hearing your story, and hearing your story in an ensemble of many other stories, to figure out what the trends are, right? Where is the mass wave of oppression happening, and how can we organize ourselves to push back against it? I want to share a couple statistics around the vulnerability of particular survivors. So Dr. Hooker already talked about the vulnerability of particularly Black folks, that the vulnerability of non-Black people of color is also based on that foundation, right? In terms of gender identity, it is really transgender Americans who are the most vulnerable in so many ways. 1 in 2 transgender people will be raped or sexually assaulted in their lifetime. 40% of all homeless youth in the US are LGBTQ identified, so not just transgender, but queer and transgender. 1 in 5 transgender people will experience homelessness at some point in their lives. The majority of hate violence homicide victims are transgender women. So I think, again, we need to push ourselves, right, to make sure our organizations are not just inclusive, but are really centering those vulnerable survivors and listening to their wisdom and in their needs. I think I also want to talk about some of our really aspirational taglines in this work. Again, beautiful visions, but I think a lot of humility is really needed when we align our lives with the cause of ending sexual violence, that work has to be intergenerational. Right? I'm almost 40, and I know for sure that this work is not ending in my lifetime. I wish it was, right? That'd be nice, but children are going to continue to be raped, I think, until the day that I die, because of how insidious child sexual abuse is, how it has been used as a tool to colonize and dominate entire nations, entire races. Until we can acknowledge that, until we have a more honest assessment of who a survivor is, it's going to continue to happen. And so to say things like, well, we're all here to end sexual violence in one generation, I think it's a beautiful goal, but I also think it sets us up for failure. And I don't want us to fail. Right? For this work to be intergenerational, it means that young people need to be here. We need to think about this work as youth organizing work. Thank you. I was a pager, so let me tell you just a little bit about how I got pushed out of this so-called movement and how I came back into it is through the Just Beginnings Collaborative Fellowship. But I worked at the Office of Violence Against Women when I was a college student as an intern and went to Georgetown. So I was in DC already. I was very starry-eyed. I was like, this is amazing. I'm writing speeches for Bonnie Campbell, and Bonnie's wonderful. She really is. She looked at little 18-year-old me and was like, take it and run with it. You're out as a survivor. This is your life experience. Let's do this. So I had the misguided assumption that that's how the professional world of ending sexual violence would operate. And then I got a job at, I won't name names, I guess, but I got a job at a national feminist organization that does legal policy work to end sexual violence. It was my first job out of college. And they had all white women leadership, mostly like second wave feminist white leadership. And then they hired like really awesome young women of color to be their program assistants. And this was 99, so not everything was digitized yet. So I was reading curricula on helping judges and prosecutors understand the trauma that sexual violence survivors go through when they go through the criminal legal system, which, by the way, was my experience, right? My lived experience. And my job was to make grammatical edits and photocopy things and make conference logistical reservations for gatherings like this. And that's it. That was my job. Don't contribute your story, don't contribute your vision. There's just no room for that here in this work. We had professionalized the work to end sexual violence as if what we were creating was a law firm. Right? If I wanted to work at a law firm, I would have gone and done that. And it was just shocking to me, the disconnect between work that really makes a place for young people who are so close to the reality of oppression, right? Just a few years out, if we're lucky, versus like who gets to stand on a podium, who gets to present a workshop, who is seen as having wisdom, right? It's funny to me to be back in the work at almost 40 when I joined this work at like 19 and now being seen as legitimate because I got older. That's all that happened, right? I mean, yes, I studied, I went to grad school, I have a policy degree, I've done a lot of work, and I don't mean to discount the wisdom that has come with lived experience. But my wisdom about what needed to be reformed about the way young people are treated when we go through the prosecution system has not changed, because it comes from when I was 13, right? We need to understand how we can bring young people into this work. And I want to call in the work of Tracy Wright, who I know is here, who works at the North Carolina Coalition for Sexual Assault. Tracy does wonderful youth organizing work with some really brilliant leaders who are, some of them survivors of sexual violence, but all of them teenagers in North Carolina. I do want to say, though, that it really raises the question of what is the work to end sexual violence? Is it only at the CASAs? I don't think so, right? Because when I got pushed out of that part of the work, I went to work for grassroots youth organizing nonprofits in New York City. I worked for an organization called Global Kids, and I worked for an organization called Make the Road New York. And at both of those organizations, we were helping high school students in low-income communities of color lead organizing campaigns against things like armed police officers in their schools and gentrification in their neighborhoods, slumlord landlords who were not repairing, decrepit apartments that were causing health risks. And of course, when you bond with young people every day, you're running programs in their school, you're young yourself. I started doing that work when I was 22. You hear a lot of disclosures. So we started to hear young people coming out about surviving sexual violence, child sexual abuse, domestic violence, and then I would share my story with them. And then they would say, well, miss, we have to do something about this, right? Why can't we do campaigns about this? And at one of those organizations, I went to, not Global Kids, so I'll let you figure out which one. I went to my boss and said, the kids really want to talk about domestic violence and child sexual abuse, and they want to run a campaign about it. And she looked at me and she said, well, that's not a winnable issue. It's not a winnable issue. What policy are we going to fight for? We can't actually make that the focus of our work. Right? the other thing is, years later, I live in Los Angeles now, and years later I went to become the executive director of a national organization that trains college students to teach health workshops in low-income public high schools that don't have health education classes. And part of the curriculum when I started that job was about teaching consent and teaching what an abusive relationship is and teaching what a healthy relationship is, and mostly teaching about peer-to-peer, like date rape scenarios. But I had mentioned to an LAUSD administrator, how wonderful would it be if we also included in this conversation around consent, child sexual abuse. And she looked at me, and this is the second largest school district in the country. She looked at me and she said, well, we can't do that because it'll just lead to a huge wave of disclosures, and our teachers are not equipped for that. I mean, I think the problem with not having young people in the room, right, is that we can come here as adults and feel really good about this conference together and then go back to our adult lives. We aren't under 18 being raped by some dad that we can't get away from, right? That's a privilege. That's a privilege. And I think it really behooves us to take some time to think about like what young people who are being raped right now in their homes, particularly gender nonconforming young people of color, queer young people of color, undocumented young people of color, right? What the vulnerable children in this country really need from us. And it does require us to be uncomfortable. It requires us to be inconvenienced, right? But what's a little inconvenience compared to the oppression that they're living through? Just makes me think so much that we have to do our work differently. And I think one of the last things I want to say about, who gets to be in this movement is, if youth organizing nonprofits are already doing work with high school students, then they need to be at this conference. If they're already hearing disclosures about sexual violence, they're already talking about sexual violence, then we can't just have a national conference of coalitions against sexual assault show up every year. We have to change our mindset about what is an organization that does work around sexual violence. LGBTQ organizations, especially those that work with youth, they're all working with survivors of sexual violence. Because LGBTQ people, we know there was a study published in Pediatrics magazine back in 2011, 2012, that says that gender nonconforming children are actually more at risk of being raped or sexually assaulted than their gender conforming peers. If gender nonconformity is a risk factor, I guarantee you that means every LGBTQ organization in this country has a disproportionate number of survivors in its membership or client base. Right? We just have to think differently about who gets to be in this room, about who gets to be at this podium, right? And sorry, I know that we're almost out of time here, but there is actually one more thing that I would be remiss not to talk about, and it is just, I think one of the major obstacles in the way that we've built this so-called movement is the fact that it has become so professionalized, right? The barriers to entry it's not just about our ageism, that's a problem. It's not just about our homophobia or our transphobia or our racism or our xenophobia or our ableism. All of that is a problem. But it's also somewhere along the way, we got so hungry for government grants and large foundation grants that we started to care more about the degrees after our name for the legitimacy than actually lifting up the leadership of survivors. And I'll tell you what I have been told by actual bosses in this so-called movement over the years, particularly when I was young and 20, 22, didn't have a grad degree, right? When my trauma, I have complex PTSD because, I was tortured as a kid, right? It's a disability, but it doesn't take away from any wisdom that I have or any knowledge that I have about what organizing is, about what oppression is. I can tell you what my own personal vision for liberation is to end sexual violence, and guess what? Every single one of the 32 people I've interviewed for Mirror Memoirs can also tell you what their vision is on how we end sexual abuse, on how we end sexual violence, because they have to think about it every day. They have a vision for what surviving looks like, because they're in the crosshairs of multiple oppressions every single day. So for me, when my trauma gets triggered, and it's not as bad at 39, almost 39, as it was at 22, but I had bosses say to me, well, you seem really triggered by the accounts that you're reading. You know, not everyone is meant to do this work. Maybe you should think of a different career. That's how I ended up getting pushed out of this movement. Instead of saying, like, how can we accommodate highly traumatized survivors to show up and have a job in a field that is about our lives, right? How do we treat PTSD as the disability that it is and make our workplace accessible? And there's 2 organizations that have done this well, and of course they're not seen as sexual violence organizations, but the Audre Lorde Project in New York City and the Transgender Law Center in Oakland, both led by queer and transgender people of color. They're both grassroots nonprofits that do policy work, that hire transgender people of color to do their work, which means they're hiring highly traumatized, brilliant individuals. And they have figured out a way to make work plans accessible, such that they're still meeting the deliverables from the foundations, right? They're still getting their grants, but they're not pushing people out of the work who should not only be in this work, but who should be leading. So I want to take, just as a final closing, right? A check-in moment with all of you. If you're feeling comfortable making noise or standing up or moving or clapping or whatever, like if you are a survivor of sexual abuse, sexual violence in some way, like please make some noise right now.
Yay! Yay!
That just literally gave me chills. Do you hear that? We're in a room of 1,700 people where so many of us are survivors, and we are told again and again and again by our bosses or our boards that somehow talking about our survivorship makes us less professional. That's fucked up. I'm really over it. Talking about our survivorship, claiming our narratives, claiming our wisdom is what makes us equipped to lead this movement. And if this is going to be a movement, then we need to know that it is about us. It is about the survivors, and anyone else who's here who is not a survivor, you're invited here as an ally. I invite you to listen to us better. I invite you to create work plans that serve us better. I invite you to understand from our stories what we need from you to support our leadership. Thank you.